and then to be responsible for receiving information from those sessions and disseminating it to the field. One of the mechanisms is through our admin webinars, and so we're very happy about having Karen share some of the information that she gained from that conference as well during today's webinar. The title of the webinar, again, is Taking on Learner Persistence with a Student-Centered Approach, the Story of Two Agencies. So you will be hearing from Karen Williams, who is the Executive Director of the Stanislaus Literacy Center in Modesto, California. And you'll be hearing from Rebecca Wagner, who is also an Executive Director of the Community Learning Center, and she's joining us today all the way from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, hence the earlier time for our webinar series today. They are going to be addressing a number of areas in their session, but some of the things that we want you to pay particular attention to that are their objectives are learning about the challenges in learner persistence that are faced by each of these organizations, which I'm sure you're familiar with as well at your site, looking at the methodologies that they use to address the issue in a student-centered way, and then seeing what the results were from approaching their issues in a student-centered way. At the end of their presentation today, there will be a few minutes to allow for some question and answer and discussion, and throughout the presentation today as well, we will have an opportunity for you to present questions that you have in our chat pods and respond to questions that the presenters and facilitators have for you today. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Karen, who is going to be starting today's webinar. Karen, it's over to you now.
All right, thanks so much, Cherise, and it's good to be here, and I'm happy to share this information with all of you. I asked, she already told you who I am, so I'm just going to kind of skip over that. And Rebecca has agreed to join me, and I just want to say a thank you to Rebecca for agreeing to be part of this presentation today. I got to hear her in Philadelphia, or in San Francisco, and I was so impressed with what she'd done. I wanted to include her in this today's webinar. So thank you, Rebecca. These are the thank you. These are the goals and objectives for today that we have kind of jointly. We both had to learn how to listen to our students, and we both found out how important that is, so we're going to share that. The two models that we had for making program changes that led to improved learner persistence in our programs, and how we used research. We both took a little bit of different approach to research, and so each is going to talk about theirs. And then sharing the lessons that we learn, because you always learn things you don't expect to learn when you're doing research on something like this. So we're going to share those things. Okay. Also, I wanted you to be aware that when I get to slide 17, I'm going to be putting up a chat pod, so I'm going to give you time to think right now, because I hate it when I have like 30 seconds to think. So if your program has done some research and made changes to try to improve learner persistence, we want you to share just a little strategy that you tried and then maybe how it turned out. Did it work out? Did you see some changes as a result? So that's going to be coming in slide 17. So I just wanted to give you that so you can start thinking about it. Okay, so here's the two approaches that we took. The Stanislaus Literacy Center in Modesto used a combination of data, student surveys, and we also used the New England Learner Persistence Project to design our project. So we had looked at what our students needed, we had listened to them through surveys, and then we also had looked at research. And out of that, we decided to set up a control group and a pilot group to practice our approach, to see if our approach was going to work. And so we had a control group that got none of the strategies and then a pilot group that got the strategies. And in Philadelphia, they used focus groups to come up with ways in which they wanted to make changes. And I'm going to let Rebecca tell you more about that. But that's how our two approaches differed. So our Learning Center, which is what we're going to the program we're going to talk about today, served 394 adults in 1011. So that kind of gives you an idea of the size of the program. You can see the breakdown in the demographics there. You can see that we are pretty evenly split between Hispanic and white, and we do have a small black population that we serve. The age groups are also pretty evenly split, although the 20-year-olds are the highest group. Again, male-female is pretty even, although male's a little bit higher, and 86% were unemployed. Average years in school were 10. And I think part of the reason why we had a little higher male population is because this GED, which is what we work on here, is employment related, so we have more people that want jobs tend to a little higher percentage to be male. So that's why I think that percentage is higher. The program design that we had was drop-in. Basically, we asked students to come at least twice a week and 2 hours a day, and we would do an intake and orientation. We would test them. We would come up with the level they were, and then out of that, we would set up their learning plan, which would include book work, computer-aided instruction, workshops on different topics, and so every student was working pretty individually. They weren't interacting with instructional staff, of which we have 1 GED instructor and 3 instructional aides and an instructor in the computer lab and a case manager. So they were interacting with all of the staff, but they weren't interacting with each other that much. And we saw that this independent study design was creating some isolation in our students. And we felt like, just based on the surveys we got back from them, we saw that they were feeling as though they were alone, and they wanted more interaction. So we decided to provide an opportunity for some of them to have that. We didn't think it was a strategy that would work for every student, but it would work for some students, and that they would benefit from leadership development and from an opportunity to bond with other students. So that's when we decided to make these changes. So the change we made was that we offered 2 classes per week to 25 students. And these classes were the same students met these 2 times a week. And they still continued to do their independent study in addition to this, but it was something that they were attending on a regular basis. So they began to develop relationships in each of these classes. In the math class, for instance, one of the things they did to build camaraderie among students was they used some opening questions. So every single class period, he would start with a question and they would discuss the question. So here's just a few of the ones they discussed. He asked them, you know, what's your dream job? What are you doing right now to achieve your dream job? And then they would talk about it. What would you tell a discouraged peer who's thinking about quitting the program? And I happened to see a video of that particular question. It was really interesting to see how they were like talking people out of dropping out and how that reinforced in them why they wanted to stay. Who are your heroes and why do you consider these individuals heroes? Tell me what you do to relieve stress from studying and what you do for fun. What motivates you? How do you stay motivated? So they would talk about those questions, and out of that they really built a rapport with the other students. And then they worked on math, and again they were doing a lot of board work where they got up and they showed how they solved a problem, and they had to sort of learn to speak in public and learn to be up in front of the class, and that was good for our students. In the second class that we did was on grammar and writing, and they did a lot of group projects and a lot of group discussion, again, centered on building relationships. And so I asked the teacher, you know, what's a couple of the group projects you did? And she said, well, one was We did an essay that we wrote together in class, and we left pieces purposely out of each paragraph. And then we had each group of 3 get together and work on finishing that paragraph correctly and then putting it all together. Another one they did was they had to pick a grammar topic from the list. Then the 3 of them had to develop a presentation that they brought back to the class. So out of this, they learned leadership, they learned presentation skills, they learned to work together. It was all those things that built relationships and camaraderie. So out of these were the things that we wanted to achieve by having these classes. So these were things that each class was trying to build into its structure. So accountability and responsibility, every student had some kind of role in the class that they had to carry out. They had group activities were sort of thread throughout the whole class. Cultural awareness, they would, in their discussions, they would bring up things so that the students could get to know each other because they are from different cultures and understand each other's culture. It developed camaraderie through networking. They had class roles, leadership roles that they rotated, and there was a process at the end to evaluate and refine the classes. And what we did was at the end, we put together a focus group from these classes, which I actually learned from Rebecca that I should do that. So we did that just so that we could improve going into this year in how we did our classes. Some of the unanticipated benefits from doing this were that since students had little, if any, high school experience, they got to have the experience of being in a high school class, if you want to call it that. Students who wanted to speak on behalf of our program at service clubs and events were pulled from these classes because they had developed those presentation skills. It inspired them to volunteer at our events. We used to hardly ever have students volunteer at events, and once we started these classes, we would have 15 to 20 students volunteering at a fundraising event. There was more group study that went on. In fact, we had to change the design of our tutoring area because we needed a place for students to go where they could talk out loud and not bother other students. So it changed the environment for all the students. And it inspired other students to get to know each other as well. So after attending the COABE conference and hearing Rebecca's presentation, I mentioned that we did a focus group. These are some of the things that the focus group came up with that we needed to do in this year. So these are things we are either working toward or have already implemented. One is a buddy system for new students. That one is in the process of being planned right now. We already implemented the quiet tutoring area study hall that they requested. We have still working on this, but quarterly celebrations for GED graduates. We did it once a year and they wanted it more often. And then transition to college components planned, and we are doing some one-on-ones between our case manager and our students. As soon as they complete their GED, the next thing is to meet with her to talk about college. So we're working on adding that component. These are the lessons we learned. We had upfront communication with staff is important when you're making changes to your design. And one of the funny things that happened out of this was you think everybody knows what you're doing, and then we had this one tutor who just wasn't as involved in our staff meetings as because of her other schedule. So she wasn't at all the meetings, and so she didn't know that these classes were closed, and she was sending students to come to the classes that couldn't be in the classes. So we figured out that you need to make sure everybody knows what you're doing, and it's not left like you just don't think they know, and you got to find out if they know. The impact on the data was positive, but we also saw personal impacts, and I just think it's important that we also acknowledge those, that people's self-esteem rose, their leadership skills rose. So it's the more soft data, I guess, than the hard data also were important. Classes don't work for everyone, and though we have implemented classes now in our program, we still see that the individualized program and distance learning kinds of programs are also important for our students. And we had to create a tutoring space for group study. So I'm going to pull up the chat box right now, and if you have anything that you would like to share about your experiences with learner persistence, I want to give you that chance to do that. Okay, I have a question up here. How did you address the increase in self-esteem? What tool did you use? We actually just saw it in their, we didn't use a tool. We just saw it in their everyday life and how they dressed and how they interacted with the staff and how they interacted with other students. It was more empirical, I guess, than anything else, just by observation. Okay. Anybody have a strategy they want to share? Did you do anything to the drop-in group to increase their persistence? Actually, we did. Thank you for asking that question. One of the things that we did was we took the group of students, we looked at the data, and we said, who's in danger of dropping out that's not involved in our classes? And we found this group, and we started meeting with them monthly to go through their progress, to make sure that they knew if they were making progress, what kind of progress they were making, if they were missing, what were the issues that were making them miss class or miss coming to the program on a regular basis. Was everything going okay? And just address any problems they had so that we were sort of had interventions in place to keep them involved. And it greatly improved their persistence when we just had the case manager meeting with them once a month. Let's see. We used the New England study of persistence, also started creating student cohorts and once-a-month orientations by doing activities. That's great. I think anytime you can get them together to do activities together, you're going to have better persistence. This one says, I love the group sharing what they would tell someone who's thinking of dropping out. Yeah, it was good because I think it made them think through why they didn't want to. Excellent attendance certificates build self-esteem also. Yes, and we do that also. We have a awards ceremony where we hand those out. I like these ideas for changing a lab situation. Thank you. So, all right, let's go back to our slides. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to share now the impacts that we had on our data from this. Hours of instruction was our largest impact. Basically, students spent more time studying. So you see that it was 52% higher for our pilot group. And you can see that in a graph style, kind of what it looked like. I'm sorry, what am I doing wrong here? In looking at the comparison of prior year data for the GED Learning Center, we found the following improvements. So this is taking all of the data from our Learning Center for that year and seeing how did it improve over the previous year. So these are the improvements we saw. We reduced our dropout rate by 10%. We had an increase of people completing levels of 7% and an increase in the number of GEDs received by 36%. So we could see this like huge impact program-wide because even if they're not involved in the project, they're still being impacted by the project. And our plans for the future, as you can see, I've kind of touched on them already. We're going to do the buddy system. We're offering more opportunities for classes. We're finding more volunteers to teach more classes because we don't have the money to hire people to teach them. So we're looking for those volunteers. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to share the project in Philadelphia.
Thank you very much for having me be part of this webinar this afternoon. It's my pleasure to be with you and share the results of one focus group that we conducted at our center. Let me first tell you a little bit about Community Learning Center. We are a community-based organization serving the neighborhoods of North Philadelphia and Center City, Philadelphia. And by North Philadelphia, I mean around the Broad and Lehigh area. So it's the southern part of North Philadelphia. It's the schools in our neighborhood have a 36.5% graduation rate. The per capita income in our neighborhood is about $7,000 per year. Citywide is about 16. So you sort of are getting a picture of what our neighborhood is like. The students in the elementary schools that surround our North Philadelphia area, 100% of the students receive free lunches. CLC has 19 full and part-time staff, and we have about 16 volunteer tutors who help us in our classroom. We use tutors both as for individualized instruction with a customized curriculum, and we also use tutors who work under the direction of teachers, sort of like a classroom aide sort of situation. What do we offer at CLC? We offer GED program classes, and in order to be in the GED class, you read at a 9th grade reading level and above, or have demonstrated competency on an official practice test, GED official practice test. We have pre-GED classes, and these are really adults who read between the 5th and 8th grade reading levels, as demonstrated on the TABE. We also have basic literacy classes. These are adults who read at less than a 5th grade level, and this is mostly tutor-based instruction, where it's 2 students to 1 tutor or 3 students to 1 tutor, kind of working on the same skills. The pre-GED and basic literacy classes really focus a lot of the instruction on reading and improving the components of reading, fluency, alphabetics, vocabulary, and comprehension strategies, whereas the GED class really focuses on content and really drives toward the goal of obtaining the GED. We also offer English language and EL civics classes in our organization. All of our classes are managed enrollment. We have one what we call a math clinic class, which is the purpose is to upskill in math, and that's sort of a drop-in, but it's still mostly managed. You just can't come whenever you want. We have certain entry points. Okay, a little bit more about Community Learning Center. We serve between 600 and 700 adult learners per year, and here's some of our demographics. Our ethnicity is over 50% is Black, African American. Our next ethnic population is Hispanic, and then white. The rest, a few low percentage of Asian, and then multiracial and other, a very small percentage. Our age group, our age range is very similar to what you heard previously, although there's not one dominant age group. I mean, 21 to 29 is high, but so is 30 to 39, followed closely by 40 to 49. So the bulk of our students are between 21 and 49 years old, and I would say mostly between 21 and like 45 years old. We are predominantly female, 63% and 37% males in our program. Okay, the core goals of our community education classes are the NRS core goals. That's the National Reporting System. Students that come into our program have one of these 4 goals: to enter employment, enter post-secondary education, workforce training, or other certificate programs, earn a GED, or retain their employment, and that's legitimate, sustainable wage. Learning gains are, of course, foundational to achieving these 4 goals. Community Learning Center, well, let me back up. Since I've been the executive director of Community Learning Center for over 4 years, my practice, my personal practice as an ED, and I've used this practice with Community Learning Center, and that is a reflective practice, always looking at what we're doing, thinking about what we're doing, thinking deeply about what we're doing, how well we're doing it. So we look at data. Every month we look at program data. We look at aggregate data, the whole program, and we disaggregate it per classroom. So we're constantly looking at our data. And when we see something that begins to become a pattern and sort of alarms us or just saying, oh, this is going in not a direction that we want, we use sort of an action research methodology. And what we do is, these are sort of the steps that we use. We collect and study current data. We're always looking at data. My staff will tell you I'm pretty much a data brain, so have a data brain. So we're always looking at data, both qualitative and quantitative data. And then we see some patterns, and then we sort of try to define the question, or what problem are we seeing? What issue are we seeing? Or what question do we have about the data that we're seeing? And then we set up a process of how to find some answers. And usually that involves collecting more data. And then after we collect some more data, we explore some interventions. Like, out of the data that we collect, what could we possibly do? And then we do something different. And that's perhaps one of the hardest things to do, is to change. Changing teacher practice, changing student behavior. So implementing interventions is really hard, and you have to offer teachers and students a lot of support around that. So we implement the intervention and we collect some more data. So we do something different and we collect some data, and it's all different. Sometimes 30 days, sometimes 60 days, sometimes 90 days, sometimes a week. It just depends on what the intervention is, and sort of we collect it over time. And then we reflect on the data again. We say, oh, look, it's, things are getting better, things are staying the same, we need to collect more time, we need to do a tweak, or this isn't working, let's scrap this idea. And then we repeat the process. So it's a process of continual improvement, always sort of using your data, anecdotal stories to improve practice and improve outcomes for the learners and make things better for the learners. So we were reviewing data after the end of one program year, and we realized that men were not persisting in our program. The 30%, 37% of our population is males, and they weren't staying in our program. And the staff all saw this as sort of a problem. Why aren't men staying in our program? What are the issues? What's happening? What are we doing? And we don't, as a practice, generally say, what are the students doing? What are they doing? What are they doing? But what are we doing? What is our ownership and our responsibility in this? So that was our question: is why aren't men staying in our program? It was pretty dismal. So in the beginning, we identified the problem, and that was men were not persisting. They weren't making it to 12 hours to the first benchmark, let alone to post-testing, let alone to getting a GED, employment, or transitioning for training. They just weren't staying in our program. So we needed to have a plan of action. So we designed a process. And as I said before on the previous slide, we used the action research process. So we had our data, and we decided, okay, how would we best know why men aren't staying in our program? And we all decided, and it seems like such a simple answer, but we all looked around each other, all 19 of us, and said, why don't we ask the men? So that's what we did. We decided to have a focus group. And that's a very powerful way to collect information. We already had quantitative data, so now we just needed some words. We needed some backup. So that's what we did. So we decided to have a focus group, and we collected some data out of the focus group, and we designed some interventions. We implemented the interventions, and we collected more data. So I'm going to share this process with you. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the focus group and some considerations when you design a focus group. First, we had to consider the size. How big did we want the focus group? How many men did we think would actually come to our focus group? So we had to figure out the size. And we ended up figuring if we could get 6 to 8 men to commit for a Friday afternoon for 2 hours, we'd be doing really good. Now, I don't know about your programs, but in our programs, in order to get 6 to 8 men, we had we had to invite at least 2 or 3 times that many. So we invited just about every man that we had in our program to see if they would come and talk with us. We decided that we would not facilitate the focus group. We found some funding, and it didn't really cost too much, but we had an outside facilitator come in who had experience with adult education, was a male, and was African American. So we thought that would increase the comfort level, increase the comfort of the men to say what they needed to say, and because very quickly in a focus group you have to establish rapport, so we thought that was be the best way to do it. He had the person that we contracted with had experience running focus groups, so we were pretty happy. And I had attended a 4-day training with the gentleman, so I knew what he could do and how he talked, and so I was really pleased. For the questions for the focus group, the facilitator did the first pass, staff reviewed it, we added questions that we wanted to ask, went back to the facilitator who removed as much bias as he could, no leading questions, no yes or no, so we could get some really deep, rich discussion from the men. Participant selection, it wasn't hard for us. We just invited as many as we could find. So we selected, every man that we could find that we could contact that had a working phone number. We decided on the date, time, and location. We had at our site where most of the men had attended a class. We decided on a Friday afternoon. That's when the site was available. And we decided 2 hours would be a good amount of time. We sent out invitations, we did letters, we did email, we did phone calls inviting men. We offered an incentive. The incentive was a token, public transportation token, to get to the focus group and to get back to their home. We also had pizza and soda. So that we had food, because everybody likes to discuss things over food. And then we also had a monetary incentive for them. So we actually gave them a little bit of cash as an incentive for coming. And the cash was $10, the token of our appreciation for participating in the focus group. Before the focus group, the people that said they would come, we reminded all those folks, I think 3 days before, 2 days before, and then the day before. And then we set up the schedule for the focus group. Our transition counselor met the men, introduced Eric, and then we left. So there was no CLC staff around. And then we came back about 2:45, and then we gave the incentives to the focus group, thanked them all for coming, and then we asked Eric for a report, and Eric was the facilitator, and then he produced a report, I think within a month. So it wasn't long before we got a report. Then when we got the report, the staff, I sent to all our staff members. They had to read it, digest it, and then we had a full 3-hour meeting talking about what we learned in the report, what interventions. Each teacher selected 1 or 2 interventions that they were going to try, and then we decided on what data collection method we would use to see if there was any change. And then we reported back. So it was after we did the focus group, it was a continual improvement process. Every month we reported on what we were seeing, what changes we saw in male persistence in our programs. Okay. So here are the results. What did we find out? The men told us these reasons for attending classes: to improve their self-worth, it was a matter of redemption, and to improve their own esteem, how they felt about themselves. They wanted to be accepted. They accepted their role as models for others. That was pretty big for the men to realize that they were role models. And some of the men accepted this readily. Some were very resistant to this, to the idea that they were role models for others. And they were others in their neighborhood, others in their family. Family pride was a big one. Another reason for attending classes was work and job readiness. Okay, that the men wanted to work. They had, one of the most significant barriers was a lack of skills, reading ability, math ability, general thinking ability, mental discipline, but also the GED, big barrier. The reason for attending classes was future financial stability. Again, that links to the work and job readiness. And they wanted to prove others wrong. They wanted others to see that they could do this. So that's why they told us why they came to classes. Okay, more words from the men in our program. Their idea, we asked them why men don't persist. And remember that some of the men in the focus group persisted, and one actually earned his GED, and others hadn't persisted. So some of the men were talking about themselves. The man that persisted and got his GED actually went to a training program and is employed now. But so these was some of their own perceptions as well as their own direct experience. They don't persist because there's a lack of instant gratification. They don't persist because there's a need to make money. They have economic responsibilities and financial responsibilities, and they just don't have time. They need to make money. And another thing that the men told us was that men can't or won't accept instruction. Now remember, we listened to this, and we were, a lot of those we went, The men told us that traits and habits that support persistence were concentration and focus, the ability to pay attention and stay focused on what they're learning and what they're doing, and coming to class. Another trait or habit that supports persistence was self-determination. Another was group support, a sense of community, high group morale. They specifically didn't like the naysayers, the people that brought the group down. They wanted to really have support of each other and, kind of cheer each other on. Another habit that supports persistence is when the teacher facilitates group process but doesn't get in the way of the process. The teachers reflected on this a lot, to facilitate group work but not to get in the way of it. And then the other thing that support persistence from their perspective was varied sources of support. And this included the teachers, this included our case managers, this included me as the administrator. They liked when I came in the classroom, they liked when I asked them how they were doing. The men liked that. They liked support from all different places in the school, and then all the support outside that they could muster. Okay, what the facilitator did was he did a profile of our focus group and sort of categorized the responses based on John Cummings' work, and the typology of forces impacting student persistence. And the positive forces that we saw were relationships, goals, teacher and fellow students, and self-determination. The negative forces were life demands, relationships. So you sort of see relationships fall on both sides, and poor self-determination falls on both sides. So that was the data that we got from the focus group. And remember, the teachers we were reading this and we're like, what interventions can we do? This is what the men told us. They told us that positive forces are relationships, goals, teacher and fellow students, self-determination. So they gave us a lot of things to think about. So when we thought about this, we thought, okay, so let's look at what we can do in our program design in terms of 3 areas. And I apologize, there's a typo on this slide. It should say suggested practices for program design to facilitate learner persistence. Okay, so we looked at kind of 3 areas. We looked at program engagement and phases of program engagement, because remember, they walk in the door, you know, then they make it to 12 hours. That's sort of our first benchmark, a level of commitment, and then make it to post-testing. Okay, best practices in program design that support student persistence. And then we asked ourselves some hard questions, actually, and that was our own personal self-assessment. So I'm going to go through each of these areas step by step. So let's look at phases of program engagement. We looked at 3 areas for program engagement. Entrance into the services. So when they came into class, how quickly and how soon did we set goals? And this was very important, not only short-term goals, but long-term goals as well. So very quickly did we set some goals. Co-develop a learning plan. How do we get to those goals? So if you set this goal, how are you going to get to the goal? What's your responsibility? What's our responsibility? Support services. And then the 4th bullet was something we worked on, and that is to honestly determine readiness. Remember, I said back at the beginning of my portion of the presentation that we are managed enrollment. So it's not a drop-in, drop-out. So you have to be ready and have to have things in place to make sure you're ready for the rigor, really, of our program. Okay. Then we looked at participation in program services, lots of instructional modes, and then again support services for learning. Tutor would be an example. And then the last one was really important, and that if learners have to stop out, do they know how to re-engage? And do we remain in contact with them so they don't feel like when they're done, when they have to leave or they choose to leave, they don't know how to come back. There's no open door for them. Okay. The next area we looked at were best practices in program design for student persistence, and we looked at our orientation and intake process. We took a hard look at instruction. We looked at counseling and peer support, and then re-engagement strategies. And I have to I'll tell a funny story at the end. So these are 3 areas that we looked at. And then finally we asked ourselves some questions. Are learners aware of incremental progress toward their goal? That our learners, our men, had concrete examples of how they're progressing toward their goal. Short-term goals, how we're progressing toward the short term. Long-term goals, how we're progressing to the long term. But making sure that learners are aware of that, not taking anything for granted. Is information obtained during the orientation when we do intake used during instruction? Did we have a good handoff to the teachers from the orientation process? Are there opportunities for cooperative learning? Can we build teams? Okay. Do support services help students build a sense of self-efficacy as they solve and overcome barriers? Okay. We had to ask ourselves, do we do that? And are there ways to identify risks, learners who are at risk? Can we learn how to do that? Okay, so here's our data. Now remember, after we reviewed all that, each teacher picked an intervention that they wanted to do, 1 or 2. And here's our data. So at the 08-09 program year, we had 37, that's individual numbers, so 37 unique men made it over 37 hours. In 9-10, that was the year where we started this project, we had 43. In 10-11, 66, and in the first 6 months of this year, we had 63, and I fully anticipate we'll get to about 130 by the end of the year. You can see the earned GED, first year 1, second year 8, last year 19, and this year so far this year, the first 6 months we had 21, and now we're at 35, and that's a 137% increase. Transition, again, you can see the increase. So by changing a few things, we were able to make a big impact to help support the men in our program. So what did we do, you say? You ask. And if you're not asking, I'll tell you what we did. We encouraged male graduates to serve as a source of support. So we asked our successful, once the men became successful in our program, we asked them to come back and support the males in our program. We did really made a focusing on goals, short-term and long-term. Teachers implemented team learning activities. The fourth item, we used sports statistics. Even the men teachers in our program didn't incorporate enough sports statistics. So it's not just the idea of using sports statistics, because not every man is involved and understands sports stats and, you know, follows sports. However, it's a really good way to have male-themed learning activities. Make sure class tasks, learning tasks were clear and discrete. And there were 2 teachers that incorporated some competitive activities, Jeopardy and other things, and the men really like that. So those were the interventions that my teachers came up with, and I'll tell you, and there's a whole lot more. These are just sort of the high level and the things that seem to make a very big difference. But the other thing we did, men couldn't see themselves in our program, and we didn't quite understand what that meant until we all looked around our room and we had pink bookcases. They were dark pink, but nevertheless they were pink. When we looked around, we didn't have pictures of males. We didn't have pictures of anybody, but we didn't have pictures of males either. So we worked on, you know, setting up the environment so men could see themselves in the environment. They could see each other in the environment. We didn't necessarily have them sit together, but they could, you know, see each other. They could become supportive of each other, and that was in the team learning activities. So we have pictures of our male graduates now. We weren't even able to have them before, but now we have pictures of male graduates, and we have pictures of male graduates with family members, their sons and their grandsons, so they sort of can see success. So I think the next thing is, I'm looking for a slide. So there's a chat pod up right now that says, with a question, if your program has done research and program design changes to improve learner persistence, what have you done? Here we go.
That's the one I did.
Oh, you did this one? Oh, where's your...
Yeah, I went on the wrong one, but that's okay. Lessons learned is probably what we need to be doing. Like, what did people take away from today?
Oh, okay. Okay, well, if you have any questions, you can type them in the pod, and then we have, I'll bring up the Q&A. Here we go. I don't see the...
Does anybody have any questions for either Rebecca or myself that they'd like to ask that we can help you with today and share with you? So I see lots of typing going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, there's one that says they're using goal setting
strategies.
Seems to be working.
Yep, it definitely helps, and a regular review of the goals, not just we set them, we put them in a folder somewhere, but a regular review.
Somebody
wants the PowerPoint. Can you tell us?
And I'm back on now, and the PowerPoint is available. If you look in the chat pod immediately below the Q&A pod, you'll see the PowerPoint there, and if you want to click on that and upload the file and then click Save to My Computer, then you will have it right there on your computer. So the PowerPoint for today's presentation is available for all participants.
Yeah. Peggy has a question here. Do you serve students in homogeneous cohorts? And the answer to that for my program at CLC is yes. It's a developmental model. We place learners. They're in like groups. They can support each other. And then when pre-GED is ready, when maybe they've taken some of the reading-based tests, then we move them up into the GED cohort. But we have a progressive model. Our classes are right down the hall. They see other teachers, so it works very well. We have another question.
Rebecca, do you have a case manager? We do. Do you have one also?
Yes, we do. And they meet with my case manager. I have one full-time, one part-time. The full-time works with the GED. The part-time works with ABE. That's only because that's what I can afford. And they meet with each class every week, and they meet with each student every week. And they review the goals, and they really work on the core goals, where the teachers work on the academic goals.
So how do you use the graduates to support the current students specifically?
Mm-hmm. We invite them to come back in. We have a time that we say, they first of two ways. They come back in during the application session, and they talk to. We ask men to come back during that time, so that the men see themselves right away in the program. They see successful men in the program, and they talk about the experience of learning, the struggles, working with CLC, and their own successes and challenges and what they did to kind of persist when it got hard. And then the other way is just periodically during the semester, we run in cycles or semesters. We'll ask a man to come in, one of the graduates, and come in and talk to the class.
One of the things that we do is when somebody gets their GED, they sometimes don't know what they're going to do next yet. They don't have a job. They're not yet ready to enroll in college, or they can't enroll for 2 months. So we suggest to them that they come back and tutor as a volunteer, and then we can give them a letter of reference that they can use to get a job. And that's been very helpful. The students are like, wow, you got your GED, how'd you do it? And so it helps them stay connected and stay in the program, because they see somebody else did it, they can do it too.
Yeah. We work on, the case manager works on preparing people when they get their GED. They're ready for the next step, like the next day, unless they have to wait for an enrollment. So a few men have come back in, but most of them want to get the heck out of there and move on to their training and into their employment, and we ask them to come back as they can. Action research would work with a larger population. I'm not sure what you mean there, Susan, if you mean a larger focused group, but action research works in all sorts of different settings. Gustavo asked, what is your role as administrator to the success of the program? Everything, Gustavo. I mean, everything. I believe my role is to support the teachers, to give them the resources they need, and then to get out of the way and let them do their job, because I hire teachers that know how to teach, and I just need to support them and like this, give them things to try, and let's try something new, and so it's everything. I mean, I think this. I don't know how Karen feels about that, but.
Yeah, I do the same thing, and when we meet in staff meetings, I just try to help them problem solve sometimes as we're like looking at data, like you said, and figure out what strategies we can do to improve whatever problem we're having. But it's more just advice, from my end. But I mostly just get out of the way and just try to make sure they have the resources they need.
Yeah, we just sort of coach.
Okay, Becca and Karen, I want to thank you both again. It is about 1 minute to 2 p.m. and I do want to honor your time as well as the time of the participants in today's webinar. It's been very, very informative, a lot of great ideas and useful information, and I can see from the discussion questions that have come up in this chat pod that there's a lot of interest in what you've done and trying to apply it back at everyone's home sites and home programs. I am going to ask that if you do have further questions for Karen or Rebecca, that you refer back to the PowerPoint that you can download below. It does have in it their email addresses as well as their contact phone numbers, and I know that they will both be gracious and very helpful to provide you answers to the questions that you might have, because we don't have time to finish addressing them all this afternoon. I again also want to thank you for your participation in the webinar, your enthusiastic participation. Please know that we do appreciate your feedback here at CalPERS, and I have scrolled this chat pod back up to the top, and you'll see that we have a webinar survey, the first item listed in this chat pod, and we'd like you each to take a moment to complete it and share any feedback that you have with us. It would be greatly appreciated. And I also want to let you know that this is the last of our official admin webinar forms for this year, but we do have another webinar and form coming up that we think is also appropriate for administrators and instructors alike. It will be on May the 16th, and it is a webinar on a quality indicators review of WASC. And for those of you who are going through WASC accreditation next year, this will be a webinar that you will not want to miss. Again, it will be on May the 16th at 2 p.m. And then we do have our last instructors webinar form coming up on May the 30th. And you might have instructors at your sites that would be interested in this, but this is looking at professional learning communities and the results of implementing a PLC at Pasadena Community College. And Susan Briggs, who is one of our participants in today's webinar, will be facilitating that session. So I hope that you will join us at 2 o'clock on May 30th for her webinar as well. And again, thank you all very, very much. We will leave the course room open for you for about another 10 minutes or so if you want to continue the dialogue and discussion with each other through the chat pod. Thank you again, and have a great afternoon. Rebecca and Karen, it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.